confers upon it. But pure memory is a spiritual manifestation. With memory, we are in very truth in the domain of spirit. From Henri Bergson, Matter and Memory. For as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. The Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son. From John 5. So here we are. Letter 20, Judgment, from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. And what a rich letter it is. And interestingly, did you notice, brothers and sisters, that most of this letter is not about judgment, but about resurrection? Good point. And this is so he jumps right into it, the discussion of resurrection and the figures rising from the tombs on the cover or on the card. And he, of course, compares the Christian notion of resurrection with pagan and Buddhist notions of the continuation and of the state of the world. So on page 557, for instance, the pagan attitude is that of accepting the world as it is. The pagan, that is, he who believes that the world is perfect, for whom the world is the God cosmos, denies the fact that the world is sick. Right? The attitude of spiritual naturism, that is, of minds whose horizon is enlarged beyond the present state of the world to recognition of the semi-cyclical evolution of the world, is that of believing that the degeneration and regeneration follow one another cyclically in the world, that falls and reintegrations of the world alternate as do the seasons of the year. And that's, of course, the attitude of some Hindu facets of Hinduism, but certainly of Blavatsky and Theosophy. And the attitude of spiritual humanism is that of people who raise themselves above the pure and simple cyclicity of spiritual naturism, and who protest in the name of the individual being against the interminable chain of cyclicity, which is the Buddhist response. But Christianity is different, and so is Zoroastrianism and Judaism, which hold to the resurrection, though not every school of Judaism. Right? So what is resurrection? Well, Tomberg says in 558. It signifies, the idea and ideal of resurrection goes further than the negation of nature, as is the case with the spiritual humanism of Buddhism. It signifies its complete transformation, the alchemical work on a cosmic scale of the transmutation of nature, spiritual as well as material, heaven and earth. There is no idea and ideal more bold, more contrary to all empirical experience, and more shocking to common sense than that of resurrection. Right? And as I said, as a biodynamic farmer, I hold myself to be in the resurrection business. Right? And he calls this, the ideal of and work of resurrection comprises the fifth asceticism, right? Which transcends natural asceticism of detachment, the asceticism of attachment, the asceticism of activity, right? Right. The fifth asceticism includes and crowns all the other asceticisms, since the work of divine magic presupposes union with the divine will, the realization and surpassing of evolution, complete freedom of the spirit, and therapeutic action towards man and nature. And I think that, at least in this part of the letter, is the key, the therapeutic aspect to resurrection. Right? The restorative, the regenerative aspect of resurrection. And this is, right, as he said, this is alchemy. This is the great work. You know, interesting. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there was a 17th century alchemist and genius swashbuckler, Sir Kenelm Digby, who engaged in experiments in palingenesis, which is raising a plant from its ashes. And he swore to have accomplished it a couple times. But what he did was not raise the corporal. He didn't return. I think he did nettles. He didn't return the nettles to nettles like as we would recognize. He, in the vessel in which he was trying to transpire this resurrection, he saw on the glass of the vessel kind of a crystallization of it looked like nettles, and he took that to be the resurrected body of the nettles, or at least the sublime body of the nettles. And so that's what I'm talking about here is that alchemy, certainly by the 17th century, and all actually all the way through, even though you have the puffers and the charlatans that Ben Jonson makes fun of in his play The Alchemist, it was really an exploration of the resurrection body. It was trying to find the science of the resurrection body. Because if you think about it, if you take the gospel accounts as they are written, it would follow that resurrection is a scientific reality. And they were trying to find how to prove it scientifically. Nothing wrong with that. Excuse me. Now, if we continue here, he draws our attention to the arrangement of the figures on the card. And he calls it the parallelogram of resurrecting forces, where the angels above with the trumpet, there's a father on the right, a mother on the left, and below is the child, right? And he says, and of course you have to pay attention here, that once again in Hermeticism, gendered typology appears. The importance of the mother and the father. And the material or physical mother and the father is whereas the spiritual mother and the father, which he really gets to toward the end of this letter. And he says, the sound of the angel's trumpet, the parental love of the father and mother, and the effort of arising of the resuscitated adolescent. Right? This is what we see. And it is the same composition of operative forces that we find in the raising of Lazarus. But this is interesting, where Jesus plays the role of the angel, the father, and the mother all at once. Kind of an interesting way to take that. I mean, I think, in a way, Tom Berg in this letter has some of his boldest pronouncements and boldest insights. Kind of daring. I mean, it's a few times you go, whoa, where'd you come with that from? Yeah, where'd you get that, brother? Right? But here's how he explains Jesus' mother, which was actually, there's a book, I can't remember, Carolyn Bynum maybe wrote that? Carolyn Walker Bynum? I can't remember, but it was a book. It's called Jesus' Mother, which is an exploration of the tropes of Jesus' mother from the Middle Ages. And here's what Tom Berg says. Now, Jesus weeping manifests the tender love of the mother. Jesus, deeply moved again, coming to the tomb and saying, "Take away the stone," manifests the active love of the Father. And Jesus crying with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out," sounds the trumpet and serving as the angel of resurrection. And he says further, just as the earthly father and mother give life to the child at his incarnation, where the angel of life sounds the trumpet in order to call his soul into incarnation. What a beautiful image. So do the celestial father and mother restore the child to life at his resurrection, where the angel of resurrection sounds the trumpet in order to call his soul and his body to resurrection. Who's the celestial father and mother? Christ and Sophia. Reminds me of Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment, with Christ in the center. It looks like Hercules, and his mother's right next to him. You know, you can tell she's praying for the souls of the departed. So it's kind of an amazing interpretation that Tomberg offers us here, and then he leads us into a spiraled revisit of the theme of forgetting sleep and death that he explored, especially in letter 13, which makes sense to come back to it at Judgment, right? Where we're also talking about death, but also a resurrection. But I won't go too much into that because we did the other time. But I will say a couple things. Because where he takes this, where he did not go in the previous letter, is into the Akasha Chronicle, which is pretty mind-blowing section of the letter, right? And he talks, he sets it up by talking about with forgetting sleep and death in the microcosm, how we have those experiences, right? How when we recall something, we recall it because we need it, and everything else we kind of forget at the moment. Like right now, I'm forgetting about millions of things probably that happened to me in life. It's because I'm concentrating on speaking with you. But, later when I'm sitting around the table after dinner, I might recall some things from my childhood or my youth, which are not even present to me at this moment. And the same with you, right? But when he gets into the Akasha Chronicle, this is some stuff right here, so we have to take our time. He says, just as the microcosm, the human being, forgets nothing in the depth of the depths, so does the macrocosm, the world, not forget anything. What occult literature calls the Akasha Chronicle is to history, which is in the process of unfolding, as the total memory of the psychic unconscious is to the conscious self's memory in action. The Akasha Chronicle is the macrocosmic analogy to the total memory of the microcosmic unconscious. Damn. That's a great way to put it. Now, I don't know if you've met anybody like this, but I have met a couple of people who swore they could read into the Akasha Chronicle. And what the one guy say? He said that my wife was the reincarnated Edgar Casey, and that I was the reincarnated Edward Bulwer Lytton, who that's kind of an insult to a poet, because Bulwer Lytton is the guy who wrote the worst sentence ever written, and it's parodied all the time. It was a dark, stormy night. But he also wrote Zanoni, the Rosicrucian Tale. So who knows? It's kind of fun. But I took that with an absolute grain of salt. Because you ever hear this story with, Rudolf Steiner, even though Rudolf Steiner, people, anthroposophists get really worked up about, they swear that Rudolf Steiner is the reincarnated Thomas Aquinas, who was the reincarnated Aristotle, and so this is one of their legends that they hold to, right? Core beliefs almost. But on the other hand, Rudolf Steiner said, "Hey, believe, you know what? Don't take my word for it. Check it out yourself. See if it works for you." But one thing he did in his lifetime is kind of funny. I don't remember where I read this, but I've known it for a long time. That he met some woman at one of his lectures who told him that she was the reincarnated Mary Magdalene. And he responded, "Congratulations, you're the 25th Mary Magdalene I've met this lifetime." Oh, guy had a sense of humor. But anyway, let's return to the Akasha Chronicle in the way that Valentin Tomberg is discussing it. And he points to the memory being threefold, right? The mechanical memory, the logical memory, and the moral memory. And he sees an analog to this in the Akasha Chronicle. And here, just to refresh your memory on 563, he says, moral memory presents a tableau of the past where the context indicates facts and sequences of facts, not insofar as they took place or insofar as they played a relevant logical role, but above all insofar as they reveal moral value and meaning. In old age, moral memory more and more replaces logical memory. And the force of memory then depends on moral force, on the intensity of the moral and spiritual life of the person in question. And interesting, and he did this before too, he says the moral memory in old age of a person will, with an awakened heart, can, in principle, replace without fault all the functions of automatic memory and logical memory. And I'd say in principle, it's a good point, but I think, and I've dealt with this in my own family, with Alzheimer's and dementia, I think with the horrible diets that were foisted upon, especially Americans, through starting in the 1960s or 50s, these dreadful diets that I think compromised nutrition, which also compromised the brain, the nutrition that reaches the brain. And I'm pretty convinced that most Alzheimer's and dementia cases we see are dietary in origin and not genetic. And so I wonder, don't get all paranoid, but I wonder if what Tomberg's talking about here with the moral memory, being able to make up for losses in the logical memory and the automatic memory, has been further complicated by these scientific interventions into diet, which were supposed to be good for us, right? Or at least they told us that they were good for us. Margarine instead of butter, that was a joke, right? Saccharin instead of sugar, it was another joke, right? Those things were devastating to people's health. Processed foods, another good one, right? Yeah, science is supposed to make us feel better. Good Lord. But and then he continues. A threefold macrocosmic memory, the threefold Akasha Chronicle, corresponds to the threefold microcosmic memory, automatic memory, logical memory, and moral memory. There are, in fact, 3 Akasha Chronicles. Occult literature, however, makes a case for only one, which is customarily spoken of as a kind of cinematographic film of the world's past, unfolding before the seer's eye, right? Things and events of the past such as they were, with all their details and with semi-photographic exactness. And people who claim to do channeling or can see into past lives, this is what they claim, right? And in my youth, I worked with a woman, worked spiritually with a woman. I was kind of really innocent, I was only 20s. And she was pretty clairvoyant that way, and she could pick up on a lot of things, and she was very insightful, but, I had at the time I was kind of impressed, but, there were things that didn't didn't add up in her insights. Now, was she really seeing into the Akasha Chronicle? Probably. She was probably getting glimpses of something, but she was sensitive. I've met people like this before. Met pretty clairvoyant people. Now, I don't think you can attribute it to the devil necessarily, but certainly the hierarchy of the left those are the kind of people they try to make look stupid. So you got to be careful in those realms, and I think for me it's just better left alone, unless you're totally grounded in prayer, meditation, contemplation, and the sacraments, and even then you got to be careful. As the case of John D. showed us. And then here's how he explains it. And he has that interesting diagram of the tableau of the Akasha, which is on page 564. And he says, this is interesting. Now, I have, I should say, I have like zero experience in this realm, but it's interesting, and I don't want to, never wanted to pursue that kind of experience because I don't know how to trust it. But he says there's a twofold process that takes place in the Akasha Chronicle. It is a spiritualized and at the same time concretized, in proportion to the extent that the distance from the present into the past increases. Right? In fact, it is a matter of a process comparable to that of abstraction. Right? A selection of the essential is retained. That is, another spiritualized Akasha Chronicle is separated off, while the waste which remains, like dead leaves, constitutes another Akasha Chronicle, the lower chronicle. I have never read this in any other esoteric source, ever, about more than one Akasha Chronicle. The Akasha Chronicle, which is present at first as one and undivided, therefore divides into two distinct chronicles that must be sought for in different spheres. One is essentially qualitative, whilst the other has a quantitative character. And then he goes, this means to say that the higher chronicle consists solely of symbolic facts, typological facts representative of a whole series of facts, leaving their number out of account, and the lower chronicle consists precisely of the series of facts rejected as useless by the higher chronicle, rejected because they are already found to be qualitatively represented by a symbolic or typological fact. Okay, interesting. So you have the higher chronicle, he's calling it, which is highly symbolic. So similar to dreams, I'm not saying it's like dreams, but similar to dreams, which are highly symbolic, or of course to the tarot, which is, but also related to the poetic consciousness, which dwells in symbols and images and not in explanations. And you could say, in a way, that the poet taps into something in, like, so poet, there was a, like Charles Williams, who wrote Taliesin through Logos, right? So he taps into something, I think, that's really true, but it's true symbolically. And I don't know, how could you tell if it's true historically? You would have to read the Akasha Chronicle flawlessly, which Tomberg says is impossible anyway. But symbolically, absolutely, that poem is true, right? Charles Williams is kind of like the representative figure like that. I think in his book, The Greater Trumps, which is fiction, it's also symbolically true, right? In this interest, and I wouldn't even dare to go into an investigation of, how to sift that into historically true. You know what I mean? That would be very difficult. So let's hear what Tomberg has to say on 565. The higher chronicle is the intelligent memory of the history of the world. It is the book of truth that one can not only read, that is see, but also swallow. That is, assimilate in such a way that it becomes always present in us. And then he quotes Revelation. It will be bitter in your stomach, but sweet as honey in your mouth. The other book, the Book of Archives, or Book of Facts, is no part of initiation. That is, it cannot be swallowed. One can draw items of information from it only by procedures such as psychometry, mediumistic clairvoyance, or also by the intermediation of beings who have access to the subterranean region where it is to be found. And which beings are those? That's the question, right? So those are, and so what he's saying is basically with the Akasha Chronicle that people talk about, there are two of them, even though he hasn't mentioned the third yet, and now he's going to get to the third. Yet there is another book, the Book of Life, of which the Apocalypse speaks. The books were opened. Also another book was opened, which is the Book of Life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, by what they had done. And he says, and again, this kind of blows up everything you've ever heard about the Akasha Chronicle. And I'm not saying you should accept it uncritically either. Certainly something to think about. But it's an interesting take on it, nevertheless. And here's what he says. The Book of Life is the third Akasha Chronicle, which corresponds to moral memory in the individual human life. It contains only what is of eternal value. That is, that which is worthy of living eternally, that which is worthy of resurrection. Right? He talks about what kinds of things you will find there. Right? And well, he says you'll find complete texts of manuscripts written by authors who, as editors, entrusted them to the four winds, addressing them to anyone into whose hands they would perhaps at some time fall. Wow! How do we unpack that? You know? And how would you read it? But also he says, and this is beautiful, one also hears there the prayer born by the last breath of a dying atheist or agnostic. The prayer which no one heard and no one expected. One sees there the radiation of the small coins put by poor widows in the temple coffers. And many things judged as small by the world. And I think, well, I'll give you an example. When he talks about atheists and agnostics and writers. Now, a lot of my friends fall into those categories. But also, you know, my background is in poetry and literary criticism. You know, and I think of figures that posterity has kind of categorized as atheists or agnostics, which I don't get the sense that they were at all. Percy Shelley is one of them. We talked about him, I think it was last time. You know, Percy Shelley was no atheist. He was no churchgoer, but he was no atheist. Similarly with the French poet Guillaume Apollinaire. I think he's one of the greatest religious poets ever to live, but he didn't write religious poetry. And likewise, I saw this recently on the internet, a scholar who was an expert at Josephine Péladan, who swore that, you know, her take is that he had nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church, which I'm sure right now Tom Briggs in the spiritual world going, what? Because he's one of the people, I think, that Tom Briggs had an intimate relationship with, though in the spiritual world. They were not contemporaries. Well, they might have been until Tom Briggs was 17 or so. I can't remember which. I think Péladan died in the first or second, I think the second decade of the 20th century. So they were contemporaries, but like I was a contemporary of Tom Briggs. When Tom Briggs died, I was 11, I think, 10 or 11. But it doesn't make us, you know, not contemporaries like I'm contemporaries with you. Anyway, let's continue. And he says, the Book of Life is therefore the moral memory of the world. It does not contain, therefore it does not contain forgiven and atoned for sins, which God forgets. All right? So this is an interesting place because, and he goes to, in the next page, he speaks of Christ as the Lord of Karma. Right? Since the incarnation of Christ, karma has become the affair of the Lord of Karma, who is Jesus Christ. Karma is therefore no more the law of cause and effect solely, which works from incarnation to incarnation. It is now, above all, the means of salvation. Right? For the remission of sins signifies their effacement from the third Akasha Chronicle, the Book of Life. Effacement. Erased from the Book of Life. And he, of course, he's established these three chronicles: the moral chronicle, the logical chronicle, and the chronicle of facts. Right? And here in this description of these, which is on 566, it's really powerful, I think. It is above all the first chronicle, that of facts, from which the entities of the hierarchy of the left, those of strict justice, draw evidence for their accusations. It constitutes the archives of the cosmic prosecution. Right? Everything you've done wrong, And I can't even begin to think of all the things I've done wrong. Especially as kids, we do so many dumb things. At least I did. And even in my youth, oh my goodness. Which is part of growing up. I mean, you do dumb stuff trying to figure out how to do what is good, right? As Topper says elsewhere, temptation's no good if you're not tempted to do something. What good is the temptation in the wilderness if you don't want the thing that's offered? Or as Oscar Wilde said, I can resist anything but temptation. Then he goes on. With respect to the second chronicle, the logical chronicle, it is virtually the totality of accounts rendered in the millennial-old debate between the cosmic advocacy and the cosmic prosecution. That is, between the hierarchies of the right and those of the left, or between good and evil. The second Akasha Chronicle indicates for each given moment the equilibrium that there is in the world between good and evil. So you think of us all with our own good and evil deeds over. I don't mean metaphysically evil, just hurting people, or even, more than hurting people, or sabotaging people. I don't think I've ever done that, but I've seen it happen plenty of times. I'm sure you have too. People plotting to ruin somebody's career, ruin their relationships. And then the third Akasha Chronicle is the source of the strength for the hierarchies of the right. It contains the supporting reasons for their faith in justice for the sake of the world, evolution, and humanity, as well as for ultimate universal salvation. The third chronicle aspires to resurrection, to the reintegration of beings, while the second is the history of equilibrium, the karma of the world, the equilibrium between good and evil. The first chronicle, that of facts pure and simple, supplies the points of support for the arguments of the hierarchies of the left, who do not believe in mankind and accuse mankind at all reproachable points. Like the line from Shakespeare, when the players have arrived and Hamlet tells Polonius, let them in and treat them well. He said, I will treat every man according to his deserts. And Hamlet says, God, this bodkin man, treat everyone according to his deserts, and who shall scape whipping? Right? Really, who shall scape whipping? And that's what the hierarchy of the left wants. Everybody to be punished. And actually, it's interesting that more and more in our own culture, the hierarchy of the left that works through the press or the media, they want to find dirt on anybody. They'll look through, they look through what, social media, or they look through your high school record or whatever it happens to be, and hold us as grown-ups accountable for dumb things we did as children. And who shall escape whipping? Who? And I don't think there's one person. But this is nothing new. Back during the Bill Clinton's first campaign for president, when they accused him of smoking marijuana, that was the big way to out people back in those days. You're gonna out them because they smoked marijuana, which just about everybody smoked marijuana at one time or another when I was in school. But Clinton came up with his rationale. I smoked it, but it didn't inhale, But on the other hand, what do you expect? He was a kid in college in the 60s. He didn't smoke marijuana, or he didn't even try it once. What good is temptation if you can't be tempted? But to digress, I don't want to go too far into that. But it's the truth, though. So we're looking at the integration of being. And I guess to back up, so think about that when you see these kinds of things happen in our culture. And think of the activities of the hierarchies of the right or the left, right? Or the egregore, right? Consider that. It should become very apparent to you. It doesn't take a lot of thought when, once you've been introduced to the idea. And then he talks about the history of looking into the Akasha Chronicle by esotericists and occultists. And it brings, I think, some interesting insights into it. And he says this on the bottom of 567. He says, the experience of the Akasha Chronicle undergone by occultists, esotericists, mystics, and hermeticists are always partial. As a general rule, the extent to which it is bearable is greater in the case of intuitive experience. It diminishes for inspirative experience and is more limited still for visionary experience. Then he points to Fabre d'Olivet's the philosophical history of the world or the human race, which is he says is kind of like the first place Hermeticism became interested in history. And then he points to after that to Blavatsky and the early Rudolf Steiner, who did also heavy excavations of, we can call it spiritual history, with Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine with the ideas of Manvantara and Pralaya, and Steiner with his ideas about the old Saturn, old sun, and old moon, and the kind of death and rebirth of the cosmos. Now that's the stuff I have to admit I never knew what to do with. I mean, I don't know how I could practically apply those things in life. I mean, kind of interesting, but it's not something I dwell with very much. And because I think, as Topper points out, it's partial. At best, it's partial. And so you're only getting a take on it. So I don't know how to process that. I mean, I like the idea. It's kind of an interesting idea. I shouldn't say I like it. It's interesting. But I got no place to put that. I got no place for it. And let's face it, we have other things to accomplish. And then he keeps moving here, right? And goes back to the problem of resurrection, right? And he says on 570, it is a matter of considering such problems as the role of human endeavor, the theological problem of work and grace, the significance of resurrection, if it is complete, and if it doesn't embrace spirit, soul, and body, or if it's only spiritual, and lastly, the nature of the resurrected body. Now he says something that I think we may have to tease out a little bit more here. It stands to reason, he says, that man cannot resurrect himself. Now, remember we talked earlier about the transhumanist movement, which actually isn't interested in doing just this. It's a kind of immortality, but in a way it's kind of resurrecting in a new body, a new computer-generated body, right? In a virtual environment, a virtual body. So it's kind of diabolical, right? I think we have to acknowledge that. But he goes on in the paragraph. All the religious doctrines on resurrection, the Zoroastrian, Judaic, Christian, and Islamic, as well as the 20th arcanum of the tarot, are in agreement on this point. Man does not resurrect himself. He will be resurrected. Resurrection, whether we like it or not, come what may. In other words, is resurrection something which purely and simply happens to man, without any participation on his part? Or is it a comprehensive act which embraces the entire circle of that which is above and that which is below, including the human will? Now he does an interesting thing. I think some very traditionalist kind of Catholics may throw out a red flag right here, because he's getting into some interesting places. And he says, pardon me, and he gives a quote from Eliphas Levi, which is about how to resurrect a body. And he notices what he says is how to resurrect the body. And there are actually not only from Levi, but in the Golden Legend there are examples from this, or from Elijah, where they put their the mouth to mouth, the heart to heart, the foot to foot, and assert the will to bring the person back to life. But the point Levi makes is that if the operator inspires in that soul much affection or great respect, if in the thought which he communicates magnetically to it, the thaumaturgist can persuade it that life is still necessary to it, and that happy days are still in store for it below, it will certainly return. And this is the point that Tomberg takes up, because and he uses the raising of Lazarus as his example, because with Jesus at the tomb, his sisters weeping, it took Lazarus's will as well to want to return. Kind of a sympathetic vibration, right? And he says on 571, just as Lazarus came out of the tomb moved by love, hope, and faith, so does the adolescent of our Arcanum raise himself, being moved not by the sound of the angel's trumpet and by the force of appeal of his father and mother, but rather by his own reaction to this appeal and this sound, by his love, hope, and faith in response to the appeal. Right? The Arcanum of resurrection is therefore one of mortality, pure and simple, wholly contrary to a pure and simple act of power. Resurrection is not at all a powerful divine act, but rather the effect of the meeting and union of divine love, hope, and faith with human love, hope, and faith. Right? Beautiful sentiment. If you probably, a lot of people have seen this movie, the movie Excalibur, about King Arthur. There's a wonderful scene, because after Merlin is entombed in ice, or crystal, I should say, he, before the battle of Camelot against Mordred, Arthur is kind of praying, thinking back to, he's remembering Merlin and wishing Merlin could be there. And Merlin appears, and not in physical form, kind of almost as a phantom form, dream form. And Merlin tells Arthur, you brought me back. Your love brought me back. Kind of the same idea that Tomberg is presenting here. Your love brought me back. And also in the story of Isis and her search for the dismembered Osiris, she remembers him. She brings him back from all the pieces of memory scattered in the cosmos. She remembers him. She brings the pieces back together as resurrection. But notice how Tomberg also ties this resurrection and the human person, humanity, our role in resurrection. And he says, still at the top of 572, the trumpet sounds from above, the whole of divine love, hope, and faith. And not only the human spirit and soul, but also all the atoms of the human body respond yes in chorus, which is the free expression, a cry from the heart of the whole being and of each particular atom, of the love, hope, and faith of man and of nature, which is represented by man. For man represents nature towards God, and he represents God towards nature. Right? We talked about this before. The resurrection of all. The renewal, the regeneration of all. And St. Paul said, right? All of creation groaneth in anticipation of this resurrection. And then another super interesting move that Tomberg takes here. He said, what would be the good of praying to the all-powerful Father for his kingdom to come, and for his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, if we were not the connecting link between him and nature? Because God could just do it anyway, right? We don't need to ask God, but God doesn't do this. And this is where it leads Tomberg into, I think, profoundly important insight about how dangerous it is to preach the omnipotence of God. Right? And he said, drawing from the Lord's Prayer, our will is truly free only in union with that of God. Right? And that's kind of a paradox, right? You know, or as John Donne says in his poem, "Batter My Heart, Three-Person God." How does he put it? Never. Oh, I can't remember the exact way he puts it right now off the top of my head. But the idea is that we can never be free unless we are enslaved to God, and never be chaste unless we are ravished by God. You know, this paradox, religious paradox, mystical paradox. And so Tom Briggs says, our will is truly only in union with that of God. Our will is truly free only in union with that of God, and that God acts on the earth only through our free will, freely united with His. Miracles are not proofs of divine omnipotence, but rather of the omnipotence of the alliance of divine will and human will. For this reason, anyone who preaches the pure and simple omnipotence of God sows atheism for the future. Whoa! Be careful, Calvinists. For he makes God responsible for the wars, concentration camps, physical and psychic epidemics from which mankind has suffered and will suffer again. Right? Because think about it. If this is the case, if God's that omnipotent, what a jerk God is to let all this stuff happen, right? Isn't this why people become atheists? Is to hear Christians preaching the all-powerful God. Well, God's letting a lot of rotten stuff happen. You wouldn't let this happen, so God does, right? That's why Tom Briggs is saying, no. The incarnation, it has to be our will united with God's will. You have a responsibility. You have blood on your hands if you don't do something. And he continues, page 573 if you're interested. Thus, it is very dangerous to preach the omnipotence of God and then to leave His sheep to extricate themselves from the inner conflicts that experience will sooner or later lead to. Ouch! So yeah, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, that means we have to do something. And let me unite my will with you. And then he says this formula, he calls it, resurrection is the synthesis of life and death. And then he gets into a discussion of the resurrection body itself. And I've always found this pretty fascinating. I remember discussing this when I was in graduate school with a Jesuit. One of my professors was a Jesuit. And I wrote a paper, and I was talking about it. I would go to meet with him after I would write, and we'd have a meeting. And talked about the resurrection body. I said, well, what's out there about the resurrection body? He goes, well, Michael, there's not a lot out there because there's only been one person resurrected. And he's not here to experiment on. And I told him about what Tom Briggs said, and he was a super intellectual Jesuit, and he was like, whatever. But he was very generous, so outside of that. But Tom Briggs asked us on 574, why was the risen Jesus Christ difficult to recognize? Because he was without age. He did not have the appearance of Jesus on the eve of Calvary, nor that of the time of the baptism in the Jordan, just as he was transfigured on Mount Tabor, where he conversed with Moses and Elijah, so is he transfigured at his resurrection. The resurrected one was not only the synthesis of life and death, but also the synthesis of youth and old age. Right? And here he says this is the problem of the resurrection body. And wow, what a paragraph this is, the bottom of 574. Modern science has come to an understanding that matter is only condensed energy, which moreover was known by alchemists and hermeticists thousands of years ago. Sooner or later, science will also discover the fact that what it calls energy is only condensed psychic force, which discovery will lead in the end to the establishment of the fact that all psychic force is the condensation, purely and simply, of consciousness, that is, of spirit. And Actually, this has been happening recently in quantum physics and quantum mechanics. They're getting to this. I think they're still a ways off from getting to where Tomberg is describing, but they're on the way. Certainly much different than it was, and I think he wrote this in 1966 or 65. He says, very different from that time in history, but getting much closer. And he goes further. Thus, it will be known for certain that we walk not thanks to the existence of legs, but rather that legs exist thanks to the will for movement. This is pure Goethe again, right? That is the will for movement which has fashioned the legs so as to serve as its instrument. Similarly, it will be known that the brain does not engender consciousness, but that it is the latter's instrument of action. Right? That part is something Steiner talked about too. I mean, this is what, and now this, of course, our culture is really hung up. You talk to any college student just about, and they ask them, where do thoughts come from? And they'll say from the brain. And then I say, okay, where do things you see come from? Your eye? No, your eye is an organ that you perceive. I said, well, maybe the brain's an organ of perception. No way, all thoughts come from the brain. Let's think about that, huh? Aren't you obligated to wonder where your thoughts come from? Is the brain a thought generator? Don't think so. And from there, he segues into an interesting discussion on heredity and what he calls condensation, or we could call it the incarnation of the individuality. Right? So we have heredity. We know what that is, right? We received information in our genes from our parents. And also we're finding out from our environments, or even from trauma that our parents or ancestors have experienced. Right? But you also have the incarnating individual. So you take on the flesh. But the flesh that you take, what you take on, even though it's not given to sin, it is given to history, right? And again, here's the horizontal and the vertical, the way of grace and the way of nature. And he says, page 575, and then he's talking about heredity, and he says that heredity interposes a foreign element between the individual free spirit and its instrument of action, the body. This is a factor which can change considerably the vertical process. Spirit, psychic, force, energy, material organs. It is another will which mingles with the process of the fashioning of the instrument of action of the individual spirit, of a kind that the body becomes the instrument not only of the individual spirit, but also of the collective will of ancestors. And he speaks further, to imitate or to create. This is the choice and trial of every soul in the process of incarnation. Now there are strong, that is creative souls, and there are weak or imitative souls. The stronger a soul is, the greater the independence from the semi-hypnotic influence of the model presented by the preceding generations of the family, chosen for the soul's incarnation. Right? So you think about it, this incarnating individuality is in this body that is conditioned or limited or whatever you want to say, or enriched by heredity, whatever that happens to be. And so, which will have predominance, the body of heredity or the incarnating, the body of propagation, we can say, or the body of the individuality incarnating. And not always easy to say. Now, interesting, he got this actually from Steiner. This is one of Steiner's key points in his anthropology. This is why Steiner and anthroposophical physicians are against childhood immunizations, because in their point of view, what childhood diseases like chickenpox or measles or mumps or whatever, what they do is they throw off heredity. Children, get rid of some of their heredity, not all of it, through getting these childhood diseases. And one of the things Steiner brought up is that you'll notice that after a child goes through one of those kinds of sicknesses, they look different. They can take on a different aspect because their individuality has more room in which to express itself. So you got to wonder, when I was a kid, I hate to sound like an old person, but everybody got chicken pox. And when my oldest children were children, they're now 20, 28, 25, and 23, and 21. They had chicken pox, but it was harder and harder for them to catch chicken pox. Then my youngest is 8. I don't think he's had chicken pox. My 10-year-old has had chicken pox. But my other kids, I think they finally got it. But they all did have whooping cough, which helped throw off some heredity. But yeah, it's harder and harder to catch those childhood diseases. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure why there is such a demand for immunizations. I think it was, when I was a kid, was that there were 5 kids got, and now there's something like 20 or more. And so that's one of the points that Tomberg is making here, not about immunizations, but about heredity versus the individuality. And Steiner's explanation was that childhood diseases throw off heredity and allow the expression of the individuality who is incarnating. So think about that. It's worth thinking about. And think about, as Tomberg points out here, those kind of people who look exactly like their parents. Have they not thrown off heredity? Or is there a strong evidence of individuality there? See pictures of people through time. Now, I don't know if, I'm sure there are ways around it. If it doesn't happen, I think there are probably spiritual methods through study and through meditation and contemplation that can subvert it. But I think, I think it's an interesting notion that there is a kind of contest between the body of heredity and the body of the incarnating individual, right? Or Tomberg calls it the force of limitation or heredity and the creative force or self-realization of the eternal individuality. Certainly worth thinking about. And then it gets more into a description of the resurrection body after that discussion, And he says, the resurrection body is that of perfect freedom. That is the perfect manifestation of the individuality itself, without impediment on the part of heredity. Right? So he's almost getting biological about this, and kind of a hermetic biology, which is interesting. And he says that, furthermore, the relationship between spirit, soul, and resurrection body should be conceived of as a reflection of the Holy Trinity. That is the reestablishment of the image and the likeness of God. Right? And he continues on 577. Thus, the resurrection body will have nothing mechanical, nothing automatic about it. In no way will it be an assembly of implements of prefabricated once and for all for the use of the will. In other words, it will not have ready-made and invariable organs. No, the resurrection body will be absolutely mobile and will create for each action the organ which suits it. At one time it will be radiant light, such as Paul experienced on the way to Damascus. At another time it will be a current of warmth, or a breath of vivifying freshness, or a luminous human form, or a human form in the flesh. For the resurrection body will be magical will, contracting and expanding. It will be, we repeat, the synthesis of life and death, that is capable of acting here below as a living person, and at the same time enjoying the freedom from terrestrial links like a deceased person. Whew! That's a lot to unpack. But fascinating, right? And then he keeps going, right? Hermeticism advances the thesis that the body is essentially as immortal as the soul and spirit, that immortality is threefold and that the whole human being is essentially immortal. Right? And it keeps going. According to Hermeticism, the essence of the body is not the matter of which it is composed, nor the energy which is produced in it, but rather the fundamental will underlying matter and energy. And it is this which is indestructible, because it exists prior to the birth of the body, and without it, birth would not be possible. More particularly, there is an essential difference between incarnation birth and propagation birth. The former is adapted to the individuality who is incarnating, whilst the latter aims at the pure and simple reproduction of the parents and ancestors without regard to the individuality who is going to incarnate. Right. And he continues, the individuality in the case where his incarnation is ruled by the law of the vertical descends consciously and of his own free will to birth, into an environment where he is wanted and awaited, whilst he is carried away by the general current of terrestrial action towards the birth, in the case where his incarnation comes under the law of the horizontal. Now, as examples of the incarnation example, he talks about the announced birth of Jesus, of the Buddha, of Zarathustra, and others throughout history. Right? Their births are announced from the spiritual world. But he says, he's not saying that all of us are just pure heredity. We're all a mixture. What those other examples were pure individuality. What most of us are is a lot of heredity and some individuality, trying to figure it out, trying to work it out, right? And of course this is the task of parents and of pedagogy is to help the incarnating child find, or develop the individuality and throw off as much of the heredity as possible. This is healthy growth, right? And then he keeps going on this in this direction with the resurrection body in 580. The resurrection body is prepared during the course of the ages. Each particular human incarnation, he's back to reincarnation now, is effected according to the law of the cross. It is vertical and horizontal at the same time. In reality, it is only the proportion between the vertical of incarnation and the horizontal of heredity which makes a particular incarnation emphasize either the law of the vertical or that of the horizontal. Hence, the process of growth of the resurrection body is gradual. The resurrection body matures from incarnation to incarnation, although in principle, it should be possible for a single incarnation to suffice. In fact, however, it is so that many incarnations are necessary to bring the resurrection body to maturity. Wow, that's heavy. And a lot to process with that. And as an example of this, he first gives a description from his own spiritual insight. He says, whilst the soul and the spirit ascend to the spiritual world, accompanied by the forces of vitality, the etheric body, and the psychic forces, the astral body, the resurrection body descends in the opposite sense, below towards the center of the earth. As it is active will during life, its descent is due to progressive relaxing of the will. Now that doesn't, at first, that might not seem to make a lot of sense, right? It becomes almost married to the earth in a deeper way, but I like that idea. And he talks about in the Requiem, right, the eternal rest grant them, O Lord, right? That's so the resurrection body, or the resurrection body in process of being built up, rests. I mean, truly rests after death. And then, but the example he gives, I think it's striking example from 1 Samuel when Solomon asks the witch of Endor to bring Samuel up, and Samuel says, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Right? Makes you think. And then he talks about from Matthew's Gospel at the crucifixion, when the souls of the saints appeared in Jerusalem, or the bodies of the saints, I should say. Sorry. And he says those bodies were resurrection bodies, which had already attained a certain advanced degree of maturity. So much to process in this letter. And finally, he gets to one of his core ideas, the Sophia, and returns to the Virgin and the Assumption of the Virgin. We talked about this last time too. Remember, I told you that in the 50s, Carl Jung was very excited and inspired by the promulgation of the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, the Assumptio Mariae, because for him that was, the integration of the anima on a global scale. And here, Tomberg talks about it, this unique event in human history, right? The Assumption of the Blessed Virgin on 582 is the unique event where separation from the body did not take place at all, where death such as we know it did not occur at all. Instead of separating from the material body and from the soul in order to descend below to the place of rest, of the sleep of peace, the resurrection body remained united with the soul and material body and ascended, united with the soul to the spiritual world. With respect to the material body, it did not decompose, but was wholly absorbed by the resurrection body. It dematerialized, spiritualizing itself to the point of becoming one with the resurrection body, in its turn united inseparably with the soul of the Blessed Virgin. Right? If you know the Eastern story about the Assumption, is that at Mary's death, she was put into a tomb or a coffin, and the apostles were waiting for Thomas to arrive. And when Thomas arrived, he wanted to see the body, and they opened up the coffin, and there were nothing but flowers in the box. And he says, one would search in vain for the terrestrial tomb of the Blessed Virgin. One would find nothing of it, since it does not exist. And he goes into, it's such a fascinating section. The mystery of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin is not identical to that of the resurrection. The latter is the last act of the drama of the fall and the redemption of mankind, whilst the Assumption brings out the history of the spirit and soul of non-fallen nature. It is not a matter of the reintegration of a fallen being, but rather the destiny of an entity who appeared in the fallen world without ever having been touched by original sin and the fall that it brought with it. That is, a virgin entity in the most profound sense of the word. The Blessed Virgin is therefore virgin nature, virgin soul, and virgin spirit since the dawn of the world. Since the dawn of the world, united and manifesting in a human person, Mary, daughter of Joachim and Anne. Right? This is Sophia united to Mary. He's really throwing it down again. Right? It was in the name of the divine Holy Trinity that the Archangel announced the Incarnation to come, and it was in the name of the Holy Threefold Virgin, Nature, Mother, Daughter, and Holy Soul, that Mary gave the response, which was the turning point of history of the world. It was Natura Naturans, naturing nature means, and non-fallen Natura Naturata, natured nature, which gave their reply at the same time that Mary pronounced these words. The eternal dialogue between creative will and executive will, where divine fire becomes light, where light becomes movement, and where movement becomes form, was projected in time and concentrated in the dialogue between the archangel and Mary. He's so excited when he writes this exclamation point. So the assumption of Mary was a subsequently or consequently neither disincarnation in the sense of separation of the soul and body, nor resurrection in the sense of union of the soul and the resurrection body, but rather the turning above towards the spiritual world of the current of life comprising spirit, soul, and body, the ascent to heaven of the integral entity of the Blessed Virgin. Right? And notice how he connects nature to the Virgin here. And I think this is one of the things you find in sophiology, that sophiology is intimately connected with a spiritually alive, a wholesome, integral environmentalism. And I don't mean environmentalism like the I hate people environmentalism. I mean, just this beautiful, lovely union of, it's in Hermeticism, right? Hermeticism is devoted to the love of God, the love of man, and the love of nature, and the reintegration of man and nature with God, right? And so, how could you not be? And I don't mean environmentalist is probably the wrong word, because it's got so much political baggage stuck to it. But this love of nature, I mean, like we find in Goethe, like we find in the Romantic poets, like in Wordsworth, right? Like we find in Novalis, like we find, in so many different artists, and the music of Vaughan Williams, for instance, is a perfect example of the united love of God, man, and nature. Even though he was purportedly an agnostic, he wrote some of the most beautiful religious music ever. So there's more going on than that. As another example we were talking earlier. So I mean, you can't. It's unavoidable. I think. This, if you find your way to Sophia, you find your way to a love of nature, and to a dedication to both of them. Right, which is fully informed by Hermeticism. Hermeticism might be like the tool of that, the method, in a sense. And then finally, with only a few pages left, does Tomberg talk about judgment. And what he says, that, where did I go? Here it is, that the emergence of complete memory of the entire past is equivalent for consciousness to the last judgment. So when this happens, the Akasha Chronicle becomes available to us. Our own deeds and pasts, our sins, right? And we judge ourselves at that moment, is what Tomberg says. Right? And he says, there will not be a single soul that will justify itself before its own awakened conscience. Right? You won't be able to justify yourself. But it's okay, you have someone who will justify it. You have to justify your Christ, the Lord of Karma. Right? And what he says in 584, the last judgment will essentially be the experience of mankind by awakened conscience and completely restored memory. It will be mankind itself who will judge itself. It will be mankind alone who will play the role of the accuser. God will not accuse anyone. He will only acquit, justify, and forgive. And he goes further. The last judgment will furthermore be the sacrament of penance on a cosmic scale, comprising universal confession and universal absolution, or as we said earlier, apokatastasis. And I think this is one of the more beautiful, moving sections in the entire book. And then he knows that people are going to say, because a lot of people, especially and I don't mean to rip on traditionalists, but traditionalists seem to be disappointed if no one's going to hell. Sometimes, some of them. What do you mean no one's in hell? They're so disappointed when they get to hell and no one's there. But here's Tomberg's anticipating this criticism. Here's what he says on 584, and he numbers them 1 and 2. Is there in the world any person or group of people who know with certain knowledge who will be impenitent in the distant future? Where'd you get this information? And 2, is there in the world any person or group of people who have the authority to specify the limits of God's love and mercy? To state and decree that the love of God goes so far and no further? Well, these 2 questions are addressed to those who believe themselves to be in a position to affirm that Origen was wrong in believing in universal salvation. All right, you can just throw the book down now. We're done, because I don't know where you go with this. Tomberg, he's absolutely right. Right? How could you ever suppose? And that's the thing, is people say, well, I don't suppose. But it's almost like they hope someone's in hell. And that is diabolical. Right? But the Lord of the dance. Well, it's really, we're thinking about, we're looking toward the card, the world, after our brief stopover at the Fool. But and even Tomberg offers an epigraph from Isadora Duncan. Christ is the Lord of the dance, and that's where we're headed, right? And everybody's invited after we judge ourselves. And he says here in 585, he will not judge. He will judge in his own way. He will not accuse, he will not condemn, and he will not impose punishments. Rather, he will give forces to souls undergoing the trial that the awakening of conscience and complete memory entails. Right? It's the Good Samaritan. And with your father, and let's go back to Edith Stein, your father's not going to drop you. Right? When you're terrified, your father's not going to let you go. And he said, and we'll end with this, and he says, finally, resurrection is the magical operation, divine and human at the same time, in which divine love and human love overcome forgetfulness, sleep, and death. For love never forgets. It is always vigilant, and it is stronger than death. I'll see you next time.